The manifest had her on it twice, and both times the men around me read it wrong. I read it wrong too. I want to say that first, before I say anything else, because everything that came after that night only means what it means if you understand that I was no better than the rest of them at the start of it. I was 24 years old, the newest man on the cadre, 3 weeks into a workup rotation I had bled to earn, and I stood on the wet steel of the supply boat's afterdeck with the printout in my hands, and laughed along with the others when her name came up under the line that read Combat Master, Breach CQB Authority. Her name was on that line, and it was on the line below it too, under EMBARKED personnel, where you'd put a passenger, a contractor, a body you were ferrying out to the rig and back. 2 entries, one woman, and the men I trusted looked at the second one and decided it told the truth, and the first one was a typo. Somebody fat-fingered the roster, Petty Officer Das said. He was a wide, weathered first class with a voice like a winch under load, and he'd been doing this kind of work since before I could shave. He tapped the printout where it sat on the chart table under the wheelhouse light. Look, they've got her slotted as the authority on the package and also as freight. Can't be both. So she's freight. Some staff weenie ashore typed her into the wrong block. Has to be, somebody else said. Out past the gunwale the sea ran low and gray, and the fog came on in long soft banks, and ahead of us, maybe 2 miles out and lost in it, was the thing we'd been sent to take. An offshore gas platform on the Tarn shelf that the company called Greywater, 4 legs and a flare stack, and a helidic riding above the swell, decommissioned and released to the program as a training hull. A place to drill the hardest problem in our trade, taking a structure full of rooms and ladders and dark, taking it fast, taking it without killing the people you were there to save. We were going to rehearse it that night. Then, if the rehearsal went clean, we'd run it for record at dawn with role players standing in for hostages and a clock on the whole thing. That was the plan. The woman was supposed to be a footnote to it. She came up out of the boat's cabin while we were still laughing, and the laughing didn't stop the way it should have. She was maybe 40, though I'd learned later I had no idea, built lean and square through the shoulders the way people are built when the strength is for work and not for show. Gray coming in at her temples under a watch cap. A plain dark shell, no patches, no swagger, a small soft-sided bag over one shoulder. She looked like exactly what Das had decided she was, a contractor catching a ride, somebody's safety observer, a body on the manifest. She set her bag down on the bench and looked at the printout on the table, upside down to her, and read it in about a second and a half, and I watched her decide not to say anything. I didn't know that's what I was watching. I thought she just hadn't understood. I'd replay that moment for years, the small flat stillness in her face when she saw both lines and chose silence, and only much later understand that she'd been on 100 boats with 100 crews who'd read her wrong, and she'd learned that the work corrects faster than the mouth does. So she let it ride. "You are right along," Das asked her, friendly enough, the friendliness of a man who has already filed you under harmless. "I'm here for the package," she said. "The package," he smiled. He looked at me when he smiled, including me in it, and God help me, I smiled back. "You hear that? She's here for the package." To her, "You ever been on a rig like this, ma'am?" "A few," she said. "Few?" He nodded slowly, the way you nod at a child telling you about the monster under the bed. "Well, you'll want to stay topside with the boat crew. It gets tight inside and we'll be moving fast in the dark, and the last thing we need is somebody underfoot who isn't," he searched for the kind word, and found the unkind one anyway, "qualified." That was when she said it. She didn't say it loud. She said it the way you'd state your height to a nurse. "I'm a combat master," she said. "Breach and close quarters. I'll watch your rehearsal and tell you what I see." The deck went quiet for a beat, and then it broke and the men laughed. I laughed. I want to be exact about the laugh because I've spent a long time being ashamed of it, and shame makes things blurry, and she deserves it unblurred. It wasn't cruel laughter, not the way you'd think. It was worse than cruel. It was easy. It was the laughter of men so certain of the shape of the world that her sentence simply didn't fit it. The way a wrong key doesn't fit a lock, no malice in the wrist, just the mechanical fact of it not turning. Das laughed with his whole chest. A younger operator named Prout laughed and looked away, embarrassed for her. I laughed because they did, because I was 3 weeks in and laughing with them was the cheapest way I knew to belong. She didn't flinch. That's the part I keep. She stood in the middle of our laughter with her bag at her feet and her hands loose at her sides and her face perfectly level, and she waited for it to run down the way you wait out weather, and when it had she said, "I'll watch from the back. I won't get underfoot." And she picked up her bag and went and sat on the bench at the stern, alone, with the fog coming up behind her. And we went back to the chart and the plan and forgot her, and the boat pushed on toward the rig. I keep thinking about how the manifest had her right there in black and white, the truth printed above the lie, and we chose the lie because the lie was shaped like what we already believed. The whole night was in that choosing. We just couldn't see it yet. There's a thing about being the new man that I didn't have words for then, and have spent years finding words for since. You are desperate to belong, and belonging is a current, and the current runs in whatever direction the group is already moving, and the cheapest, fastest way to feel the current carry you is to laugh when the group laughs at the thing outside the group. I knew, somewhere under the laugh, that I had no standing to laugh at anyone. I'd earned 3 weeks. She'd earned the line on the manifest that I was laughing at, but the knowing was quiet and the current was loud, and I went with the current because the current felt like home and the knowing felt like cold water. That's the mechanism of it. That's how good men who would die for a stranger, come to mock the one person in the room who could save all their lives. Not malice. Current. The terrible easy pull of the thing everyone else is already doing. I have watched that current run in a lot of rooms since, and I have learned to feel it the way you learn to feel a riptide. The moment when the group decides, all at once and without a word, that someone is outside, and the pull starts, and the cheapest thing in the world is to let it carry you. I felt it on that boat and I let it carry me. And the only reason I can tell you about it honestly now is that the night took the certainty I'd bought with that laugh and broke it over my head, plank by plank, hour by hour, until there was nothing left of it but the shame and, underneath the shame, the beginning of something better. The cadre lead was a senior chief named Calloway, and he was not a cruel man either, which I say because it would be easier if he had been. He was hard the way good steel is hard, tempered, not brittle, and he ran a tight deck, and he'd kept men alive in places I only knew from the news. When he came up from below and got the brief from Das, he looked back at the woman on the stern bench for a long second, and I saw something cross his face that wasn't quite the laugh the rest of us had shared. A small uncertainty. He'd been around long enough to have met a few people who didn't look like the legend and were the legend anyway. But the manifest said freight, and the clock said rehearse, and a senior chief with a clock running doesn't chase small uncertainties. He filed it where Das had filed it. "Keep her out of the lanes," he told Das. "She wants to watch, she watches, from the catwalk, not the stack." "Aye," Das said. So she was benched, officially in the way that mattered, by the man whose word was law on that hull. Right along wait. A body on the manifest, kept to the catwalk out of the lanes, while the real men did the real work. I was glad of it. I'll own that too. I was glad because her being benched confirmed the world I wanted to live in, the one where I'd earned my place and the place was real, and the line on the printout that said Combat Master over a woman's name was a clerical ghost. Every man on that boat had a reason to want her to be freight. And the reasons were all the same reason. And the reason was that if she was what the first line said she was, then a lot of what we believed about who got to be elite was wrong. And nobody wants to find that out at sea in the fog with a hard night coming. We came up on Greywater out of the murk like something surfacing. First the smell, old grease and salt and rust, and the cold mineral breath of the sea moving through the legs. Then the shape, the legs going down into the swell and the deck riding high above us with its rails and ladders, and the dead flare stack against a sky going the color of a bruise. The supply boat nosed into the loading platform at the base of the southwest leg, and the swell worked us up and down against the fenders, and we went up the wet ladder one at a time with our gear, into the cold and the dark and the iron, and the rehearsal began. I'll tell you how a takedown rehearsal works, because the whole night turns on the difference between doing it and doing it right, and you can't see that difference unless you know the shape of the thing. You don't storm a rig. That's the first lesson and the one the movies get wrong. You peel it. A structure like Greywater is a vertical maze, decks stacked on decks, connected by ladders and stairwells and catwalks, with the people you want to reach scattered through it and the people you're fighting moving between the levels faster than you can. You can't be everywhere, so you choose. You pick your entry. You build your stack, the line of men who will flow through a door or up a ladder in a fixed order, each one covering a slice of the space so that together they cover all of it. And you move through the structure in a sequence that never leaves a cleared space at your back and never pushes you into a space you can't hold. Breaching, you call it when you make your own door instead of using theirs, and you do it with charges sized to the steel, because too small and the door holds and you're stacked up in the open, and too big and you've killed the room behind it, hostages and all. It is arithmetic and it is craft and it is the most dangerous thing we do. And that night, on Greywater in the cold and the fog, the cadre did it wrong. Not badly wrong. That's the thing. To my eye, 3 weeks in, it looked fine. Calloway built the stack and we flowed up the southwest stairwell and peeled the production deck room by room, and Das called the breaches and Prout set the simulated charges, and we moved with the hard, fast economy that had made me proud to be among them. It looked like the real thing. It looked like the thing I'd come to be part of. But she was watching from the catwalk, and she saw what I couldn't. I noticed her up there twice. Once at the base of the stairwell, standing back in the shadow of the leg with her arms loose, her head turning slow to follow the stack as it moved, the way you'd watch a play you'd seen 100 times and were watching now for the one actor who kept missing a mark. And once on the second deck, when the stack hit a blind junction, a place where 2 passages crossed and a ladder came down into the cross from above, so that you had threats possible from 4 directions and only enough men to cover 3. Calloway's stack flowed into it the way we drilled, and for a second, just a second, there was a slice of that junction nobody was covering, the down ladder, the high line, and if the role players had been live shooters with a man up that ladder, 2 of us would have been dead before we knew the ladder was there. I didn't see the gap. I want to be honest about that. I was in the stack, I was covering my slice, I was doing my job and feeling good about it. I learned about the gap later from her, when she walked Calloway through it inch by inch with a patience that never once tipped into "I told you so," but she saw it from the catwalk in real time. I know because when the stack flowed through the junction I happened to glance up, and I saw her go still, not tense, still, the particular stillness of someone watching a thing go wrong that they already know how to fix, and her lips moved just slightly, and I found out later she'd been counting the slices, counting the men against the angles, running the arithmetic we weren't running and coming up every time 1 man short of the geometry. I want to give you the feel of being inside that stack, because it matters to what came after. There is a thing that happens to you in a good stack, a kind of narrowing. The world shrinks to your sector, the slice of space you and only you are responsible for, and you stop seeing the whole and start seeing your piece of it, and it feels like mastery. It feels like being part of a single organism that knows what it's doing. We flowed up the southwest stairwell 2 by 2, Das calling the movement low and flat, and we hit the first compartment and split it down the center line, my half and Prout's half, and it was clean, and we flowed on. And I felt the thing I'd come out here chasing, the feeling of being one of the qualified men doing the qualified work in the dark. And the whole time, the feeling was a lie, and I couldn't see it, because the narrowing that makes you feel like mastery is the same narrowing that blinds you to the gap. I was covering my slice perfectly, The slice nobody was covering was the one no slice was assigned to: the high line, the down ladder, the seam between sectors where the geometry needed a man we didn't have in the count. You can't see a hole you've been trained not to look at. You can only see it from outside the stack, from above, from a catwalk, with a notebook and a lifetime of having drawn these lines for other people to stand on. When we cleared the production deck, Calloway called a reset and we ran it again. And again it looked clean to me. And again, I know now, the same hole opened at the same junction, the high line naked for the same fatal second. 4 times across 4 passes, and 4 times a thinking enemy would have dropped 2 of us into the dark, and 4 times we flowed on feeling like masters. And 4 times a woman on the catwalk counted us 1 man short and wrote it in a weatherproof notebook by penlight and said nothing, because she'd offered the correction once already in her bones and learned the night was young and the work would speak. We finished the rehearsal a little after midnight. Calloway called it on the helideck, the whole stack assembled in the cold with our breath smoking, and he was satisfied. You could see he was satisfied. The peel had been fast, the breeches clean, the timing tight. By every measure he'd been taught to use, it had gone well. Good work, he told us. We tightened the second deck transitions and we run it for record at 06. Get some rest, eat something. Das has the watch bill. And that was when she came down off the catwalk. She came down the ladder without hurry and crossed the helideck to where Calloway stood, and the men's eyes went to her the way eyes go to a thing that's out of place, and a couple of them traded looks, and I felt the old easy laugh wanting to start up again at the edge of the group. The ride along, coming down to give the senior chief notes. "Senior chief," she said, "you've got a hole in your second deck transition, the cross junction below the upper ladder. Your stack can't cover the high line with the count you're flowing. You lose 2 men there every time against a thinking enemy. I watched it happen on all 4 passes." The helideck went quiet, not the laughing quiet from the boat, a different quiet, the quiet of men waiting to see how the senior chief would put this woman back in her box. Calloway looked at her a long moment. I'll give him this, he didn't laugh. He'd seen the junction too, somewhere under his satisfaction. A man at his level always half knows where the soft spot is. But he had a clock and a manifest and a deck full of men watching, and he did the thing that the clock and the manifest and the men made easiest. "Noted," he said, flat, final. The word you use to end a conversation, not to start one. "We'll tighten it, thank you." And he turned back to Das and the watch bill, and the woman stood there for a second with the correction still in the cold air between them, and then she nodded once, to herself more than to him, and went and found a place out of the wind by the stack base and sat and was frayed again. I remember being relieved. The box had held. The world was the shape I wanted. I went to find a corner to sit in, and as I passed her I almost said something. I don't even know what, something to smooth it over, something that would have been for me and not for her. And she looked up at me, level, unbothered, and there was no accusation in it at all, and somehow that was worse than if there had been. She'd seen me laugh. She'd filed it the way she filed everything, without heat, and gone back to watching the rig. I found a place out of the wind in the lee of the accommodation block, where a few of the others had hunkered down to eat cold rations, and trade the kind of low-talk men trade when the real work is hours off, and the body needs to forget that for a while. Prout was there, the young operator who'd looked away embarrassed when she'd been laughed at on the boat. He was the closest thing I had to appear on the cadre, 2 years senior to me but young enough still to remember being the new man, and he handed me half a protein bar without being asked, which was his way of being kind. "You see her up on the catwalk," he said quietly after a while. I had, but I didn't want to admit how much I'd watched her. "Right along," I said, which was the safe thing to say, the thing that kept me inside the group. Prout chewed for a while. "My uncle did this work," he said. "Long time back, retired now. When the manifest came through with that name on it, I sent him the line. He didn't look at me. He wrote back one word. He wrote Saltmero, just like that with the question mark. And then he wrote, "If that's who I think it is, you boys keep your mouths shut and your eyes open." I felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the fog. Who'd he think it was? He didn't say, he just said keep your mouth shut. Prout finally looked at me, and there was something uneasy in his face, the face of a man who's begun to suspect he's standing on the wrong side of a thing. I laughed anyway. On the boat, you saw me. I laughed too, I said. Yeah, he looked back out at the fog. I keep thinking about my uncle's question mark. I didn't know what to do with that, so I did what the new man does, which is nothing. But it saddened me. It saddened me while I watched her, because I did watch her more than I'd admit to Prout. She'd found a spot at the base of the flare stack where she could see most of the rig at once, and she wasn't resting. That was the thing I couldn't stop watching. The rest of us were eating, talking, dozing where we could, doing the human thing of stealing comfort from the gap before the work. She was reading the rig. I watched her eyes move along the catwalks and the ladders and the dark mouths of the passages, slow and methodical, the way you'd read a page, and every so often she'd shift her position a few feet to see an angle she hadn't seen, and settle, and read some more. She had a small notebook out at one point, weatherproof, and she made a few marks in it by the light of a shielded pen and put it away. I edged close enough once, pretending to look for a dry place to sit, to see what she was doing, and I saw she'd sketched the cross junction, the one our stack had failed at, and beside it she'd drawn the angles, the 4 lines of thread into that intersection, and counted them and written a number. And beside the number she'd written the count of men our stack flowed through it, and drawn a small hard line under the difference. She wasn't gloating over our failure. She was solving it, on paper in the dark, for a correction she'd already offered and been told noted about. Working the problem anyway because the problem was real whether or not Calloway wanted to hear it. I went back to my corner and I didn't tell Prout what I'd seen, because I didn't have words yet for the thing I was beginning to feel, which was the first crack in the certainty I'd laughed out of on the boat. A ride-along doesn't sketch breech geometry by penlight at 2 in the morning when nobody's watching. A ride-along eats her rations and stays out of the lanes. Whatever she was working the same problem the senior chief had set aside, and working it harder than any of us, for no audience and no credit, as if the rig itself were the only thing she answered to. I didn't sleep. None of us really did. The fog thickened through the small hours until you couldn't see the supply boat at the base of the leg, couldn't see the water, could only hear the swell working against the iron below and feel the whole structure breathe with it, that slow, cold groan of a thing standing where it has no business standing. I sat with my back against a generator housing and listened to it and thought, the way you do at 3 in the morning in a strange place, about whether I belonged there at all, and about a one-word question with a question mark on the end of it, and about a woman sketching angles in a notebook for no one. Then the radio on Doss's chest hissed, and a voice came up out of it, taut and stripped down the way a voice gets when the speaker is working hard to sound calm, and the night stopped being a rehearsal. It was the boat crew. The supply boat, the one we'd come out on, the one tied at the base of the southwest leg. And the voice on the radio said the fog had brought in a vessel none of them had seen until it was alongside. A low, fast hull running dark, no lights, no call, and there were men coming up the loading ladder out of it, armed, and the boat crew were 3 unarmed sailors with a takedown cadre's worth of weapons locked in a hard case they couldn't reach, and the men coming up the ladder were not role players. I have replayed the next 90 seconds more times than I can count, and the thing I come back to every time is not the fear, though the fear was real and total and made my hands cold. The thing I come back to is that the cadre, the real men, the qualified men, the men who had laughed froze. Not from cowardice, I need that understood, they were brave men. They froze because the night had just changed shape under them and the new shape didn't match anything on the brief. The rehearsal had a script, this had none. The role players were friendlies, these were not. The clock had said 06, it was 3. And in the gap between the world they'd planned for and the world that had just arrived. Even good men lose a beat. And a beat is a long time when there are armed strangers climbing your only ladder out of a fog you can't see through. Calloway recovered first. He was the senior chief. Recovering was his job, and he started giving orders fast and clipped, and they were good orders, but they were reactive, each one chasing the last new fact instead of getting ahead of it, and I could feel the night sliding toward a place none of us wanted to go. A confused, dark fight on a structure none of us fully knew against a number we hadn't counted, with 3 unarmed friendlies somewhere below us in the middle of it. And then a voice cut across the radio chatter and the cold, low and even and absolutely without hurry, and it said, "Stop, everybody stop, listen to me." It was her. She had crossed the Helidec while Calloway was still giving orders, and she stood now at the center of us with that same square stillness, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not reach for a weapon, and she did not ask permission. She just took the air out of the panic the way you'd take a kettle off a flame. "Senior Chief," she said, "your 3 sailors are unarmed on the loading platform with hostiles coming up the ladder. That's your hostage problem and your clock. Everything else waits behind it. May I run this?" It was the most extraordinary thing I had ever heard one person ask another. "May I run this?" In the middle of it, to the man who'd said noted and turned away. And the extraordinary thing was the way she asked, not as a challenge, not as a told you so, but as a professional offering a hand to another professional who was, for one understandable beat, underwater. There was nothing in it that cost Calloway anything to accept except the thing he decided about her on the boat. I watched him pay it. I watched a senior chief with 20 years on me make the hardest call of the night before a shot was fired. The call to set down what he thought he knew about a person, because the work needed setting it down, and he made it in about 2 seconds, which is faster than I would have, faster than almost anyone would have, and it's the second bravest thing I saw anyone do that night. I have thought a great deal about why I rank it second, and the answer matters, so let me say it plainly. We tell ourselves that the brave thing is the dangerous thing, the shot taken, the door breached, the ladder climbed under fire, and those are brave. But there is a quieter kind of courage that almost no one talks about, and it is the courage to be wrong out loud fast in front of the people who watched you be certain. Calloway had stood on that boat and let her be benched. He'd said noted and turned away. Every man on that deck had seen him do it. And now, with the night going sideways and his own people in danger, he had to reverse himself completely in 2 seconds. In front of all of us, to hand the most dangerous problem of the night to the very person he'd written off, and there is a particular death in that, a death of the self that has to be certain to lead, and he died it without a flicker, because the work needed it. He set down his pride the way you'd set down a weapon you've realized is pointed the wrong way. I have tried to be that kind of brave ever since, and I have mostly failed, because it is so much harder than climbing a ladder. The ladder only asks your body. This asks the thing you've built your whole life on, and asks you to lay it down in the dirt in front of the men you lead, and pick up the better thing instead. The bravest thing, of course, came later, and it was hers, and it was made of 90 held seconds in a dark room. But Calloway's 2 seconds bought her the chance to be brave, and without his 2 seconds the night ends another way in the dark badly, and I have never once heard him take credit for it, and so I take it for him here. "Go," he said, "you've got it, we're yours." And the woman, the manifest called freight, took the stack. What happened next I can only describe from inside it, as the man it happened to, because she never once stopped to explain herself in the moment. The explaining came later with the file. In the moment there was only the work, and the work was like watching someone do long arithmetic in their head at the speed of speech, every figure landing in the right column, no figure wasted. "Names," she said. "Fast. Who's your best shooter on a moving target in low light?" "Prout," Calloway said. "Prout's with me." "Das, you've got the most rigged time, you're my structure. Who knows the loading platform layout cold?" "I rigged the fenders this afternoon," I heard myself say, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. "I was down there an hour. I know it." She looked at me. The man who'd laughed. She looked at me for half a second and made a decision with no time to make it in, and the decision was to use me anyway, because I had the thing she needed and she didn't have the luxury of holding my laugh against me. "You're my eyes on the platform," she said. "Hardigan, right? You're with Das." Then to all of us, raising her voice just enough to reach the back of the group, never past it, "Here's the picture. We do not fight our way down to them. We go down quiet and we get above them, on the catwalk over the loading platform where we can see the whole ladder and they can't see us, and we make the platform a place they can't be. We do not start the fight until I have a clean line on every man on that ladder, and none of my own people are in it. Anybody who fires before I call it is going to get one of those 3 sailors killed. Does everyone understand me?" It was not a question. We understood her. And then she did the thing that I have come, in the years since, to think of as the truest mark of what she was. She slowed down. With armed men climbing the ladder and 3 friendlies in the kill zone and the clock screaming, she took 10 seconds, I counted them, the way she'd counted our slices, and she walked the geometry out loud, fast and exact, so that every man knew not just his job but the reason for his job, because she knew, the way the best of them know, that men move better through fear when they understand the shape of the thing they're moving through. "The catwalk wraps the loading platform on 3 sides," she said. "Das, Hardigan, you take the south run. You'll have the ladder head and the fender line. Prut, me, north run, will have the boat and the water side. Calloway, I want you and the rest holding the stairwell at the top, because if this goes loud, more of them come up out of that boat, and I need the high ground behind us held by the man whose deck this is. We move now, we move quiet, and nobody touches a trigger until you hear me say the word. The word is mark. Until you hear mark, you are invisible and you are patient, and you are the most disciplined you have ever been in your life. Go." We went. I have been on operation since that have made the papers, and I have stood next to men whose names you would know if I were allowed to say them, and I have never, before or after, felt anything like the way that scattered, frightened cadre came together under that woman's voice in the next 4 minutes. She didn't make us brave. We were already brave. She made us coordinated, which is a rarer and more valuable thing. And she did it by being so completely without panic herself that there was no panic left in the air for us to breathe. Das and I went down the south ladder to the catwalk in the dark, and I found the fender line in the fog by feel and memory, and I put my hand on Das's shoulder and guided him to the rail where the whole loading platform opened up below us, gray and slick and terrible in the murk, and I saw them. 4 men on the ladder, a 5th on the platform already low, moving toward the wheelhouse of our supply boat where the 3 sailors had taken cover. Dark hulls, no markings, weapons up, real. The cold of seeing them went all the way down into my legs. And then I heard her voice in my ear on the net, low and even. "I have 4 on the ladder and 1 on the deck. Prut has the deck man. Das has ladder 1 and 2. Hardigan, you're not shooting, you're calling. You tell me the second any of my sailors moves into a line, you understand me. You are my conscience down there. Everybody hold." And we held. This is the part I most want you to feel, because it is the part that separated what she was from what we were. We held when every nerve in my body was screaming to fire, because there were 3 unarmed men below us in the dark, and she would not buy their rescue with their lives. I have to tell you what holding cost. I was 24 and I had never seen a man killed, never seen one try to kill me, and below me in the gray fog were 5 strangers with rifles moving toward 3 sailors I'd ridden out with that afternoon, and every animal part of me was a single white wire of need. Fire. Fire now. End it. Make the fear stop. My hands shook on the rail. My breath came short and loud in my own ears until I was sure they'd hear it down on the platform. I had a man in front of me, ladder 1, close enough to see the wet shine on the barrel of his weapon, and the word to end him was sitting right there in Das's chest waiting for the order. And the order would not come, because she would not give it until it was clean, and the not coming was the longest agony I have ever stood inside. And here is the thing I understood only later, lying awake replaying it. The agony was the discipline. The whole of what made her what she was lived in that gap between the need and the order. Anyone can pull a trigger when the wire goes white. The trade is full of men who can do violence fast. What almost no one can do, what she did, what she made us do by sheer steady will down a wire in our ears, is hold the violence on a leash past the point where holding it feels like dying, because the holding is the only thing that keeps the people behind the enemy alive. She wasn't waiting because she was slow. She was waiting because a fast shot at ladder one might have sent ladder two diving for the wheelhouse where the sailors were. And a man cornered next to a hostage is a dead hostage. And she had run that whole branching tree of consequence in the half-second. The rest of us spent screaming inside our own skulls, and come out the far side of it knowing exactly how long she had to hold, and exactly what she was buying with the holding. She waited until the four on the ladder were stacked close enough that the angles were clean, and the one on the deck had moved past the wheelhouse and away from the sailors, and only then, when the geometry was hers and not theirs, did she say it. Mark. I have heard a lot of gunfire. I have never heard any as disciplined as the 4 shots that followed that word. Not a barrage, not a spray. 4 shots almost together but not quite, each one a man's careful work. And when they stopped there were 4 men down on the ladder and the deck, and the 5th was Prout's, and Prout had him. And the loading platform was quiet again except for the swell and the 3 sailors' voices coming up shaky from behind the wheelhouse. Alive, all 3, alive. I stood at the rail with my heart slamming and my hands still shaking, and I realized I'd been holding my breath for the whole 11 seconds, and I let it out, and it came out as something close to a sob. And Das reached over without looking and gripped my shoulder once hard, the grip of a man who'd been new once too and remembered the first time the white wire let go. Neither of us said anything. There wasn't anything to say. The fear was still all through me. But underneath it now was the first cold, clear thread of a different thing, the understanding that I had just been kept alive, and so had 3 sailors, by a discipline I had laughed at on a boat 8 hours before. It had taken 11 seconds from Mark. It had taken 4 careful minutes to set up those 11 seconds. That ratio, the long, patient setup, the short, clean act was the whole of her, and I was too green that night to know I was watching a masterwork. I thought we'd gotten lucky. I would learn there was no luck in it anywhere. But it wasn't over. It was barely begun. Because the men on the ladder had come from somewhere, and the somewhere was the dark, fast Hull tide alongside our supply boat. And as the echo of the 4 shots died, I heard her on the net again, already ahead of it, already counting the next thing. That was their entry team, she said. There'll be more on the boat and more already up in the structure. They didn't send 5 men to take a platform. Calloway, hold that stairwell. Das, Hartigan, hold the platform, you own it now. Nobody comes up that ladder. Prout with me. We've got hostiles loose above us, and I will not have them between us and the high ground. A pause, half a beat, and then the thing that told me, even green as I was, that I was in the presence of something I didn't have a name for. And somebody find out where the rest of our people are. The role players. The civilians we brought out for the dawn run. They're on this rig and they don't know it's real. I had forgotten them. We all had. In the rehearsal they were friendlies to be rescued on a clock. In the panic they had simply dropped out of our minds. She, running a live fight, having just killed 5 men, with more coming, had not forgotten them for 1 second. Somewhere on Greywater, on an upper deck, 8 civilian role players were asleep or waking, confused in the dark, and a force we hadn't counted was moving through the structure toward them, and the woman we'd benched as freight was the only one of us who'd kept them in her arithmetic the whole time. The next 2 hours were the hardest of my life, and I lived them mostly in the dark, on the catwalk and then in the structure, doing what she told me through the net in that low, even voice that never once rose. And I want to give you the shape of how she ran it, because the shape is the proof, And the proof is the whole reason I am telling you this at all. She did not retake the rig in a charge. She strangled it. She knew she'd written the book on knowing I'd find out that against an unknown number in a structure you don't own, speed kills you and patience saves you. And she imposed patience on all of us by sheer steady will. She had Calloway hold the stairwell so the enemy couldn't flank us from below. She had Das and me hold the platform so they couldn't reinforce from the boat. And she took Prout and went up into the dark to find the civilians and the rest of the hostiles, peeling the rig the way she'd watched us fail to peel it. Except now every transition was covered, every blind junction held, every slice of every angle accounted for, because she had the geometry in her head the way the rest of us had our own names. There was a stretch in the second hour where I got pulled off the platform. Calloway sent me up to reinforce her stack for a hard transition, the cross junction, the very one our rehearsal had failed at, and so I got to see her work up close in the dark for about 20 minutes, and those 20 minutes did more to remake me than all the rest of the night put together. She moved through that structure like water finding the shape of a pipe. I've been trained to clear a room as a series of explosive moments, burst in, dominate, move, and she did something almost the opposite, something slow and total and far more frightening to be on the wrong end of. Before we took the junction, she stopped us short of it in the dark, and she didn't say a word. She just held up a closed fist and we froze and she listened. I learned, watching her, that most of clearing a structure is listening, that a man's boot on wet steel 2 compartments away tells you more than any optic, that the rig itself will tell you where the enemy is if you go quiet enough to let it. She listened to that junction for a full minute. Then she repositioned us, one man at a time with small flat motions of her hand, until we covered every line into it, including the down ladder, the high line, the slice our rehearsal stack had left naked, and only then did she flow us through, and there was a man up that ladder. There was a hostile waiting in exactly the spot that would have killed 2 of us in the rehearsal, and because she'd covered it, he never got the chance. Prout took him. Clean. We were through the junction and into the next compartment before the echo died, and she was already listening for the next thing. She never once raised her voice. She never once moved fast when slow would do. And she never, not one time in those 20 minutes, lost track of where every one of us was. She'd call a small correction to a man's position without looking at him, knowing by the sound of his movement that he'd drifted a foot out of his lane, the way a conductor hears one violin go flat in a full orchestra. I had thought I knew what competence looked like. I'd been doing this work 3 weeks, and I'd thought the cadre was the ceiling of it. 20 minutes on her stack, and I understood that the cadre and I had been doing a careful imitation of a thing she simply was, the way a man who's memorized a poem is doing an imitation of the man who wrote it. When she sent me back down to the platform, she put her hand on my shoulder for a second, the only time she touched any of us all night, and she said, low, just for me, "You did fine on that junction. You held your slice." And that was all. But I went back down the ladder into the dark carrying those 6 words like they were a medal, and I think that's when the laugh on the boat finally died in me for good, replaced by something I didn't have a name for yet, and have spent the years since calling, for lack of a better word, shame turning into respect. And she did it on a budget. That's the detail nobody who wasn't there ever believes. We had a takedown cadre's loadout, but a takedown cadre plans for a 40-minute problem, not a 4-hour one. And somewhere in the first hour she did the math on our ammunition and our breaching charges and our air. There were spaces on that rig you needed breathing gear to clear, old gas pockets in the lower decks, and she started rationing. Over the net, calm as a quartermaster, she'd tell Prout to take the shot with the carbine and save the heavier rounds. Tell Das to hold a charge because she might need it for a door that mattered more. Tell me to breathe slow on the platform because she might need my air bottle for the men going low. She turned a loadout built for one fast problem into a supply line for a long, slow one, and she did it in her head, in the dark, while fighting, and not once did she sound like a person doing arithmetic under fire. She sounded like a person reading a book she'd written. The hardest moment, the one I will carry until I die, came in the third hour, on the upper accommodation deck, where she'd finally found the civilians. She'd peeled all the way up to them, Prout on her stack, and she'd found the 8 role players herded into a single cramped berthing space by 3 of the hostiles, who'd figured out by then that the rig was contested and decided the civilians were worth more as shields than as nothing. 3 armed men, 8 unarmed civilians, in a steel box the size of a shipping container, in the dark. I wasn't in the room. I was on the deck below by then, holding a ladder head she'd told me to hold, and I heard the whole thing over the net, and I have never in my life heard discipline like what I heard in the next 90 seconds. Because she had a shot. Prout told me later, Prout was beside her, that she had a clean line on one of the 3 hostiles the instant they came up on the berthing space, a fast shot that would have dropped him and started the thing. And she didn't take it. She held it for 90 seconds, Prout counted, the way we'd all started counting, the way you count when you're standing next to someone whose patience is the only thing between 8 innocent people and a massacre. Because one of the civilians, a frightened man who'd come out for a training day and walked into a war, was standing in a place where the fast shots follow-through might have caught him if the hostile moved wrong. 90 seconds. With armed men holding 8 innocents in a box, the woman we'd called Freight waited 90 seconds in the dark for a line that did not pass through a single innocent person, and she got it. And when she finally moved, she and Prout took all 3 hostiles in a span of time so short that Prout said the civilians didn't even understand it had happened until it was over, and not one of the 8 was touched. I think about that 90 seconds more than I think about almost anything else from that night. Anyone can be fast. She taught all of us, that the rarest courage is the courage to be slow when everything in you and around you is screaming to be fast, to refuse the shot that might save you now because it might cost someone else everything, to hold the patience like a held breath until the world gives you the clean line you're entitled to. That's not a skill you can drill into a man in 3 weeks. I'm not sure you can drill it into him at all. I think some people simply decide, early and forever, that they would rather lose the easy way than win the wrong one, and that decision is the whole difference, and she had made it long before any of us met her. There was one more thing she asked of us before the end, and it was the hardest thing of all, because it asked us to do nothing. By the 4th hour we had the civilians, we had the platform, we had the stairwell, and we had, by her count, and her count was the only one that had been right all night, 2 hostiles left somewhere in the lower decks, the last of a force she'd estimated at 14 and then proven right about, body by body, as the night wore on. 2 men in the dark, in the part of the rig where the old gas pockets made the air bad, with a single working exit that came up through a sealed hatch onto the deck where we stood. And she made a decision that none of us would have made, and that I did not understand until it was over. She had us go dark. "They're cornered," she said over the net low. 2 men, bad air, one way up, and that way up is us. They have a radio, I've heard it. They're talking to that boat, or to whatever's out in the fog, and right now they're telling whoever's listening exactly where we are and what we're holding because they can hear us holding it. So we stop. Everybody on this deck goes silent and goes still and goes dark, no net, no lights, no movement for 9 minutes. We let them think we've pulled back. We let the radio go quiet from their end because they think the threat's moved off. And then, when their picture is wrong, we take the hatch. 9 minutes of nothing. It does not sound like much when you read it. I am telling you that 9 minutes of deliberate, planned, total stillness, in the dark, on a deck above 2 armed men, with the fog pressing in and the rig groaning under us, and no way to know if the plan was working. 9 minutes of that is the longest thing I have ever endured. Every instinct I had screamed that we were giving up the initiative, that we should hit the hatch now while we had numbers and they had nothing, that the stillness was a kind of surrender. I lay in the dark with my heart going like a hammer, and I did not understand, and I held anyway, because by the 4th hour I would have held anything she told me to hold, the laugh on the boat 7 lifetimes behind me. I understand it now, the way you understand things years later, turning them over on slow nights. She had grasped something about that whole engagement that none of the rest of us, fighting it from the inside, could see. That we and the enemy were both reading each other through sound and through the radio, and that whoever could make the other side's picture wrong would own the next move. All night we'd been winning by being where they didn't expect, above them, patient, covering the slices they thought were open. The dark gap was the same idea taken to its hardest edge. She didn't go still because she'd run out of moves. She went still because stillness was the one move they couldn't read, the one thing their ears and their radio would interpret as retreat, and she was willing to buy that misreading with 9 minutes of the most agonizing patience I have ever shared, because 9 minutes of agony was cheaper than the lives a loud assault on a cornered enemy would have cost. She was always paying in the cheaper currency. Patience instead of blood, silence instead of noise, the held shot instead of the fast one. The whole night, when I added up, was a woman refusing again and again to pay in lives what she could pay in discipline, and having the discipline to spend. And it worked, of course it worked, because she had read it right the way she'd read everything right. When we took the hatch at the end of the 9 minutes, the 2 men below had stood down off their alert, had set their weapons aside in the bad air to conserve themselves, had told their radio the deck above had gone quiet, and they were going to try to wait us out. And we came down on them out of a silence they'd been taught by their own ears to trust, and it was over without a shot. 2 men on the deck with their hands empty, alive, because she had wanted them alive if she could have them that way. She had spent the whole night taking only what she had to take. The arithmetic of mercy is harder than the arithmetic of force, and she did both in her head at once all night and never dropped a figure. It was nearly dawn when she brought us all back up to the Helidek, the cadre, the 3 boat sailors, the 8 civilians, the 2 prisoners zip-tied, and watched and stood us down. The fog was thinning. You could see the gray water again, and the dark fast hull dead alongside the supply boat where Calloway's stairwell hold had kept anyone from reaching it, and out past it the first cold light coming up under the cloud. The civilians came up onto the Helidek in a tight, frightened clump, blinking in the gray, some of them still not understanding what had happened to the training day they'd signed up for. One of them, the man who'd been in the line of her refused shot, though he didn't know that, would never know that 90 seconds of someone's iron patience was the only reason he was breathing, kept asking, to no one, to everyone, "Is it over? Is it really over?" And it was Prout who went to him, Prout who'd been beside her for the worst of it, and put a hand on the man's shoulder and said, "It's over. You're going home." And the man looked at Prout and then looked past him at the woman standing apart by the flare stack, because some animal part of him had understood, the way the rescued always understand before they're told, who the still point of the whole night had been. He didn't have words for it either. He just looked at her, and she met his look for a second and gave him the smallest nod and looked away, and that was the whole of it. I stood there in the thinning fog, and I did the thing I'd been too busy to do all night, which was count. I counted the people on that Helidek the way she'd been counting all along. 3 sailors, 8 civilians, the cadre, all of us, the 2 prisoners. 21 souls who had come out to a dead rig in the fog, and 21 souls going home off it. And the arithmetic of that, 21 for 21, every column balanced, not one figure dropped, was the most beautiful and the most humbling thing I had ever stood inside. And I understood that it had not been luck, and it had not been the cadre, and it had not been me. It had been her, and her notebook, and her listening, and her refusing the fast shot, and her holding the dark gap on faith, and her doing the hard mercy arithmetic and the hard force arithmetic in her head at the same time for 4 hours without once raising her voice. Every person who'd come onto that rig was alive. Everyone. The 3 sailors, the 8 civilians, the whole cadre, even the 2 we'd taken last. The only dead were the men who'd come up out of the fog meaning to do murder, and even those she'd taken only when the geometry left her nothing else, never one more than the night required. She stood on the Helidek in the gray light, the same square stillness she'd had on the boat 8 hours and 100 years before, her shell dark with salt and the cold steaming off all of us. And she said to Calloway, in the same even voice she'd used to take the stack, "Your people are all accounted for, Senior Chief. The structure's secure. You'll want to get the civilians off first and call this in clean. It's your hull again." And she stepped back out of the center, the way she'd stepped back into the freight corner on the boat, handing it back the moment it was done, wanting nothing from it, the work itself apparently the only thing she'd been after the whole time. And that's when Das said it. Das, who'd laughed loudest, who'd called her freight, who'd told her to stay topside out of the way of the qualified men. He stood there gray-faced in the dawn with the night behind him, and he looked at her the way you look at something you've gotten catastrophically wrong. And he said, half to her and half to himself, in a voice with no winch left in it at all, "Who are you?" She didn't answer him. She just looked at him level, the way she'd looked at me when I almost spoke to her on the boat, without heat, without triumph, and she let the question hang. It was Calloway who answered it. Calloway, who had access to the manifest and the sealed packet that came with it, the personnel file that traveled with a combat master, the one we'd none of us thought to open because we'd all decided the line was a typo. He'd already gone to the boat's hard case for the satellite gear to call it in, and the sealed packet was in there with the mission documents, and I watched him stop, with the radio in his hand, and look at the packet, and then set the radio down and open it instead. I was close enough to see his face change as he read. I have spent my life trying to describe the way a hard man's face changes when the floor he's been standing on turns out to be a ceiling, and I have never gotten it right. So I'll just tell you what was in the file, the way Calloway read it out, slow, into the dawn silence on that helideck, with the whole cadre standing around him and the woman standing apart. Her qualifications first. The combat master ticket, the highest close quarters and breaching certification our trade has, the one maybe a handful of people on the coast hold at any time. The deployments, a column of them, places and dates most of which were still classified, and which Calloway read as redactions, line after black line, the kind of record you only get by going to the worst places enough times that they stop writing down where you went. And then the byline. Because here is the thing about Greywater, the thing that turned the night from a story about a brave woman into a story I have to tell, that I am not allowed not to tell. The doctrine we had rehearsed on that rig that night, the stack discipline, the peel sequence, the breaching arithmetic, the rules about covering every slice of a blind junction, the whole method we had executed imperfectly and she had executed flawlessly, that doctrine had a name on it. An author. The program manual the cadre trained from, the one Calloway had learned it from and taught it to us from, the document that defined how our entire community took down a structure like that one. She wrote it. Calloway read her name off the file, and then he turned the manual up. He had the manual, of course he had the manual. It was in the case with the mission docs, and he turned to the title page where the authorship was logged, and it was the same name, and the call sign beside it was Saltmero. And the date was old enough that some of the men on that deck had learned to do this work, had learned to be elite, had learned the very steps they'd used to laugh at her, out of a book she'd written before they'd ever held a weapon. The helideck was silent. Not the laughing silence from the boat, not the waiting silence from the rehearsal. A third silence, the deepest one, the silence of a group of proud men all understanding the same enormous thing at the same moment, that the line on the manifest that said combat master had not been the typo. The typo had been us. The whole night, the whole bench, the whole easy certain laugh, that had been the error printed over the truth, and the truth had been standing on the catwalk the entire time, counting our slices, keeping our civilians in her arithmetic, waiting for the work to correct what the mouth never would. Calloway closed the file. And then the senior chief, the man whose hull it was, the man who'd said noted and turned away, the man who 20 years and 1,000 hard nights had built into someone not easy to humble, Calloway came to attention. I had never seen him come to attention for anyone. He was the one men came to attention for, and he squared up in the gray dawn light with the salt and the dead fog on him, and he brought his hand up slow and exact in a salute, helmet still on his head, and he held it, and he said, in a voice I had to strain to hear, "Ma'am, I read noted off your correction 6 hours ago. I was wrong. You held this rig with my own doctrine while I watched, and you brought every soul on it home. I'm sorry I laughed." And then Das came to attention beside him. Das, who'd called her freight. He didn't say anything. I don't think he could. He just brought his hand up and held it, and his jaw was working, and his eyes were wet, and he held the salute like a man holding the only apology he had. And then Prout. And then the boat sailors who hadn't even laughed, who saluted anyway because they understood now what had stood between them and the bottom of the sea. And then, one by one, every man on that Helidec, in no order anyone called, came to attention and saluted the woman the manifest had called freight, and the dawn came up gray and cold and clean behind her, and she stood in the middle of it. I was last. I want to be honest about that too. I was last because I was the most ashamed, because I had laughed with the least reason to 3 weeks in, having earned nothing. I'd laughed at a combat master to buy myself a place among men who turned out not to deserve the certainty either. I came to attention last, and my hand shook when I brought it up, and I couldn't get any words out at all. She returned at once. One salute for all of us, brought up and held a moment and brought down, the way you acknowledge a thing without making more of it than it is. And then she said the only thing she said to us at the end, and she said it in that same even voice, looking not at any one of us but at all of us, at the whole proud humbled cadre standing at attention in the dawn. "You held the lines I drew," she said, "before you knew I'd drawn them. That's the doctrine working the way it's supposed to. It should hold even when you don't know whose it is." A pause, the gray light on her face. "Don't salute me. I'm not the thing that mattered tonight. The thing that mattered is that every person who came out to this rock is going home off it. Remember that part. Forget the rest." And she picked up her soft-sided bag from where it had sat by the stack base the whole night, untouched, and she walked to the ladder to go down to the boat, and she went down it without hurry, the same way she'd come down off the catwalk, the same way she'd done everything. And she was gone into the gray, freight again by her own choosing, wanting nothing the night could give her that the night hadn't already given. Calloway put her on the record. I'll say that for him last. When he made the call in, voice still not steady, he put her name and her call sign into the official log of what had happened on Greywater. Saltmero, combat master, who took command of a compromised cadre during a no-notice live engagement, and brought 21 souls off a contested structure with 0 friendly losses. He read it slow so the man on the other end would get every word. He made sure it was written down right this time. The manifest had been wrong twice, and he made sure the log was right once, and I think that was Calloway's salute, the real one, the one that outlasted the dawn. I have told this story a handful of times in the years since, always to younger men, always to the ones 3 weeks in who laugh too easily because laughing is the cheapest way to belong. I tell it to them the way I've told it to you, and I always end it the same way, with the thing I understood standing last in that line with my hand shaking and no words in my mouth, the thing she'd been trying to teach us all night without ever once saying it out loud. The manifest had her right there in black and white. The truth was printed above the lie the whole time. We laughed because the lie was shaped like what we already believed, and the most dangerous thing a man can do, more dangerous than a dark rig or a fog full of strangers, is to mistake the shape of his own certainty for the shape of the world. She never argued with our certainty. She just outworked it quietly in the dark until it had no choice but to come to attention. I have never laughed at anyone's qualification since. Not once. When a person tells me what they are, I open the file now. I learned that on a cold rig in the fog from a woman who wrote the book we beat ourselves with, and who never raised her voice, and who saluted us back exactly once, and who I am proud to this day to have been the last man to salute. I never saw her again. I looked once or twice, the way you look for a name you're half afraid to find, and I never did find it, because the places she'd been were the kind that don't print names. And the work she did after Greywater was the kind that travels under redactions and dates and a call sign and nothing more. She'd wanted nothing the night could give her, and she wanted nothing I could give her after, and I think in the end that was the last lesson, the one underneath all the others. The people who are most worth saluting are almost never the ones who came for the salute. She came for the work. She came because 21 people needed to go home off a rock in the fog, and she was the one who could make that happen, and the making of it was payment enough. The stars on a file, the byline on a manual, the cadre at attention in the dawn, those were ours to give and ours to feel ashamed we'd withheld so long. They were never what she'd been after. And that, more than the shot she refused or the gap she held or the doctrine she wrote, is the thing I have tried hardest and longest to become, and the thing I most want the young men I tell this to understand, that the surest sign of the real article is that it does not need you to know it is the real article. It just quietly drew the lines and held them and let the work say the rest.